Sénatrice Gerba.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Honourable Senators, I have the honour to address you from the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. I rise today to respond to inquiry number 4, submitted to the Senate by our colleague, Senator Mary Coyle, on the urgent need to address the effects of climate change in our country and around the world. I thank the Senator for reminding us of our duty at a time when, according to a very recent Léger poll, 70% of Canadians are concerned, even very concerned, about climate change. Dear colleagues, from November 6th to 18th, the United Nations Climate Change Conference, COP27, will begin in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. The parties present at the previous conference, COP26, held in Glasgow, reaffirmed the objective adopted by the international community known as the Paris Agreement to maintain the objective of a global warming not exceeding 1.5 degrees Celsius. Glasgow also emphasized the need for urgent scaling up of clearly identified actions, funding for capacity building, and technology development to build indispensable resilience and reduce the vulnerability of many, if not all, to climate change. A new report from UN Climate shows that countries are having an effect on global greenhouse gas emissions and curbing them, but emphasizes that these efforts are still insufficient to limit the global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. According to the report, the combined climate commitments of the 193 parties to the Paris Agreement could put the world on a path to about 2.5 degrees Celsius of warming by the end of the century. The report also shows that current commitments will increase emissions by 10.6% by 2030 compared to 2010 levels. Dear colleagues, climate change is not a figment of the imagination. It is hitting hard on all continents, and it has, in recent times, seriously affected our country, particularly British Columbia, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland and Labrador, and part of Quebec. Unfortunately, that is the sad reality. Its effects are visible everywhere. It is happening in Africa, where governments and civil society groups are stepping up their climate resilience efforts. According to experts, Africa is suffering the effects of global warming, even though the continent pollutes much less than all other continents. Indeed, Africa emits barely 4% of greenhouse gases, but is experiencing accelerated warming, a continuous increase in temperatures well above the global average, land and ocean combined. The effects of these changes are considerable. Rising sea levels, melting ice caps on African mountains such as Mount Kenya in Kenya, the Mount Rwenzori in Uganda, and Mount Kilimanjaro in Tanzania, and drought that is spreading across the continent. 14 of the 23 countries that have experienced drought-related emergencies in the last 2 years are on the African continent. Drought affects both rivers and lakes, as in the case of Lake Chad. Drought speeds up desertification and degradation of agricultural land, and causes population displacement and famine. Currently, an estimated 1 million people have been displaced by climate change in Somalia, and more than 20 million people are at risk of famine in East Africa, according to the World Food Programme. Another effect of climate change in Africa is floods that are intensifying on the continent. Their consequences are terrible: destruction of property, increase in epidemics, and other effects. In Nigeria, unprecedented flooding has killed 363 people, displaced nearly 2 million people, and destroyed more than 618,000 homes. In South Africa, last April, severe flooding killed nearly 400 people. Without decisive action globally and in Africa, it is projected that by 2030, 100 million Africans living in extreme poverty will be severely affected by the effects of climate change. 100 million is almost 3 times the population of Canada. In the face of such current and future calamities, the question arises: is there an African perspective, African solutions to the challenges posed by climate change? Dear colleagues, at the last UN General Assembly in New York, the President of Senegal and current President of the African Union, Mr. Macky Sall, said, and I quote, "There is also an Africa of solutions, replete with natural, human, and agricultural resources, with governments that are at work, and a vibrant and creative youth that innovates and also undertakes efforts." Honourable Senators, several initiatives have been undertaken by African countries to reduce the continent's vulnerability to the effects of climate change and increase the capacity of populations to cope with climate change. Solutions can be found in nature itself. These include using the strengths of the natural world to slow down and cope with climate change. According to the United Nations Development Programme, UNDP, protecting forests and mangroves could save Africa up to $500 billion in climate change-related losses. UNDP experts on climate issues in Africa believe that the forests of the Congo Basin, for example, have a very significant climate change mitigation potential. In this regard, Madagascar recently introduced the cultivation of aquatic plants, still called rambo or sand sedges. This crop allows for a better resistance to drought and creates a greater availability of arable land. The Comoros Islands and Malawi have adopted for continuous tree planting to address the impact of climate change on the environment and on people. The Seychelles, for their part, have decided to dig dikes to cope with the flooding. The transition to renewable energy in Africa has also progressed impressively over the last decade. Indeed, many countries have been working to increase their capacity to transition to a sustainable energy future. In Morocco, for example, more than a third of electricity is already renewable thanks to the Nour Ouarzazate solar power plant, the world's largest concentrated solar farm. This is also the case for wind power plants in Ethiopia and Cape Verde, which are increasingly reducing the use of fossil fuels and hence toxic gas emissions. According to forecasts by the International Renewable Energy Agency, these energy sources could account for up to 67% of electricity production in sub-Saharan Africa by 2030. Some African countries and the African Development Bank are advocating and investing in sustainable transport. In Senegal, for example, public transportation in Dakar now includes an express train and a bus rapid transit system with electric vehicles. In 2021, Kenya equipped itself with thousands of electric motorcycles for urban travel and is encouraging people to adopt these modes of travel. Dear colleagues, you will have understood that African countries are increasingly working to increase the resilience of local populations and their ability to adapt to climate change. But the biggest climate resilience initiative in Africa is the Great Green Wall. This is the continent's flagship program to combat desertification and fight food insecurity and poverty. The program aims to transform the lives of millions of people by creating a vast mosaic of green and productive landscapes across North Africa, the Sahel region, and the Horn of Africa. Adopted by the African Union in 2007, the Great Green Wall initiative brings together more than 20 African countries, as well as international organizations, research institutes, civil society, and community organizations. The wall will link Dakar, the capital of Senegal, to Djibouti, covering 11.7 million hectares. However, while Africa presents innovative solutions for climate resilience, it must be recognized that the African continent faces financing challenges to boost climate resilience. I want Canada to champion these commitments to the continent at the United Nations, at the G7, at the OECD, at COP27, in short, wherever the climate emergency is on the agenda. I very much hope that Canada will advocate to support African requests to support their policies in this area. At the launch of the Senators' Climate Change Group, our colleague Stan Kutcher said, and I quote, "History will not judge us on economic well-being or on the strength of our GDP. History will judge us on our actions on behalf of the most vulnerable, on behalf of future generations, on behalf of humanity. The fight against climate change is therefore one of the aspects on which history will judge us." End of quote. Dear colleagues, I encourage all of us to speak out on this important issue from our own points of view and perspectives, and if you have not already done so, I invite you to join the Senators for Climate Solutions group. Thank you.